So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Whiting, I'm your dean. So tonight is an evening focused on an architect that is someone who forms space and place. He's also a historian, so it's quite fitting to begin by acknowledging our place and space in history. The Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what's now known as Cambridge and Boston. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and we honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. And a quick reminder that we have live captioning available at the front of the auditorium for this audience and online for our virtual audience. To enable captions, those of you who are virtual, please click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your live stream window. I greatly admire the captioners who do this. I can't imagine their lives, especially given tonight's lineup. It's very challenging, so please be understanding if they don't get everything exactly right. I also want to invite you to join us for an upcoming public program on Monday, October 3rd at 12:30 p.m. Architect and researcher Sasha Deltz will give a public lecture on how we can counteract pervasive myths of housing provision and urban production using cooperative practices. We invite you to attend all programs here at the GSD. Just check out our website for further information. And now for tonight's event. Tonight is a special event in the school. It's really a familial moment for us all. We celebrate two of our own, Rodolfo Machado and Jorge Silvetti, who have combined taught at the GSD for 71 years. 24 for Rodolfo, 47 for Jorge. You can tell which department I was in. They were both chairs, Rodolfo in UPD and Jorge in architecture, and they founded their office, Machado Silvetti, in 1985. Just outside Piper, we have all had the immense pleasure of immersing ourselves in their work and, dare I say, in their minds, thanks to the extraordinary exhibition in the Drucker Gallery, Unprecedented Realism, selections from the Rodolfo Machado and Jorge Silvetti collection. We have a lot of speakers tonight, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities to applaud, but we also want to make sure we get to the exhibit, so take note of that. So Rodolfo coined this powerful term, unprecedented realism, in 1986, and I wanted everyone to just take a moment to pause over it, because it's easy, we've had this term with us for a long time, and it's actually easy to kind of gloss over it. I admit, when I saw the title, I sort of thought, yeah, of course, unprecedented realism. Realism that has no precedent. It's a pretty wacky idea. Rodolfo and Jorge combine the challenges and urgencies of the real world, habitation and participation, with the unanticipated, whether it be an unanticipated mix of influences or an unanticipated formal or material invention. Invention bound to realism. I'd say it's a great way of explaining, ideally, what we do at the GSD every day. We engage the world, but we all try and push its compass needle into unprecedented territory. Tonight, we also celebrate the curatorial work of Mark Lee, chair and professor in the practice of architecture, and Remi McClain, MArch class of 2022. We also celebrate our extraordinary exhibition team, led by Director of Exhibitions Dan Borelli, who managed to hang this complex show under complex circumstances. Additionally, we welcome to tonight's stage a number of GSD alumni and friends, many of whom appear in the credits of specific projects in the exhibition, or who were students or colleagues along the way. We have, in short, a lot of voices collected here today, and a lot of fodder to fuel this evening. While it's been planned, it hasn't been scripted, so I have a feeling it's going to be a little bit like a long Thanksgiving afternoon without the food, though someone may well find themselves getting cranberry sauce spilled on them along the way. let me lay out tonight's program notes in brief. Jorge S. Silvetti, what's the S for, Jorge?
I don't have it anymore, but sometimes it falls. I drop for that name, but it will remain.
We'll get to the bottom of this. Jorge S. Silvetti is the Nelson Robinson Jr. Professor of Architecture Emeritus at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where he has taught for the past 47 years. He was chair of architecture from 1995 to 2002. He received his first degree in musical theory and performance from the Conservatory in Buenos Aires and is responsible for the school having a grand piano in the pit, which lives there right now, though it is not tuned, as far as I've heard. Though it is played, and I think of you every time I come in the school and hear someone playing it. Jorge went on to obtain his degree in architecture from the University at Buenos Aires, and then his master's degree from Berkeley, where he first taught immediately upon his graduation. He taught for another 2 more years at Carnegie Mellon before landing here at the GSD in 1975 as an assistant professor of architecture. He and Rodolfo launched Machado Silvetti Architecture and Urban Design a year prior in 1974. I wanted to lay out this core, if you will, of Jorge's formation, because this imbrication of pedagogy and practice with piano music in the background at all times defines Jorge and is important to have in mind as we listen tonight to an event in 2 parts: a panel discussion on the exhibition and then a series of tributes to Jorge from a few of his students. We'll end with some remarks from the honoree himself, and then we will all retire to the exhibition, where we can raise a glass to Jorge and Rodolfo both amid their extraordinary drawings, models, and objects. And so now, let me turn the podium over to Mark Lee, Chair of the Department of Architecture, Professor in Practice of Architecture, and a Principal and Founding Partner of Johnston Mark Lee, and he will take you to the next step. Mark.
Hello? Okay, we're 40 minutes here. So hi, I'm Mark Lee. I'm the chair of the architecture department. I'm joined together with Remi McClain, my co-curator of the exhibition, together with Dan Borelli, Inez Salduendo, and Whiteside. Jorge, Rodolfo, and the office were all responsible for putting this exhibition together. I also have to credit the students. You know, there are 2 seminars that Jorge taught last year titled Regarding the Archive and Interpreting the Archive, where the inquiry and the discussion with the students really helped shape the show. I'm really excited to see so many former friends and students of Jorge and Rodolfo here. I myself, unfortunately, was never a student of Jorge's because I didn't get into a studio from the lottery. I complained to Mac, but nothing happened. But I was very happy to be a TA for Jorge during those classes, so I could be an honorary student. As Sarah mentioned, the exhibition draws on the archival collection of Machado Silvetti at the Francis Loeb Library, consisting of 2-dimensional work, models, discursive material, reflecting the entire scope of the design processes of Machado Silvetti's lifelong production of buildings. We hope this exhibition will help to provide a cross-section through the career of Rodolfo and Jorge's that offers a series of narratives reflecting the evolution of architecture at large over the last 5 decades. Remi and I tonight are joined by Erika Naginski, Robert Hubbard Professor of Architectural History here, Florencia Rodriguez, editor, writer, academic, who taught here and now the new director of UIC School of Architecture, Nader Tehrani, a professor and former dean of the Irvin Channing School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, studied and taught here and the founder of NADA, and then Jesús Vasallo, architect and writer, associate professor at Rice University, also one of our distinguished alumnus. So 40 minutes is a very short time, you know, with such a rich body of work, and it's hard to distill down. But I think Remi and I would like to start off with a few prompts, some of the thematics that came up not only during the class or those 2 seminars that Jorge taught, but also through the curation of this exhibition. So I would start with one question, and I wonder if some of our guests could start either reminiscent or ponder upon. I think one of the things that was very strong was that emerged during the class and the exhibition was the role of history, or the role that history plays in the design process. Certainly, when we look at some of the projects, some of them are very explicit. You know, we think of Rodolfo's country house, or the origin of the La Montiquilla was important as a reference, or the direct reference of the fountain wall and the Anforte. But even there's some indirect references. You know, when I look at their projects, when I look at the Speroni Square or the Port in Palermo, I couldn't help but think of Rossi's Locomotiva, the urban figure as a strong form, or references. I think of certainly the Indian stepwells when I see the fountain house and such. So I know many of you have written, such as Nader, about the work or the role that history plays, so I'm curious to see if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Should we just break into it?
Why not?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly history plays a large role in the work, but it's also important to historicize the question in the sense that when we were in school, the presence of history, the context within which architecture was operated on, established a rapport with typologies, precedents, and an idea about intertextuality, sometimes explicit, but often much more elusive. And I'd like to speak later on to the elusive signifiers that are sort of embedded in all of those drawings, because they form a kind of erudition that is embedded in the creative process. And Unprecedented Realism in great ways has a lot to do with that, because the real is rooted in some form of social convention, and history is a central component of that.
Well, I'll jump in. I suppose as the resident historian here, when I first came to the school, and this is a celebration of Jorge, when I first came to the school, I learned that I was going to participate in the canonical presence of the teaching of history here, called Buildings, Texts, and Contexts, in which Jorge had played a foundational role and had sought, even at the start, to bring into conversation the architect and the historian. And in fact, this was quite literal. Howard Burns and Jorge, these conversations unfolding over the weeks, where the historian would step in and delve into the wondrous worlds of the Renaissance or the Baroque, and Jorge would show up and read the hell out of buildings. And I came to this school from MIT thinking, oh my goodness, how am I possibly going to replicate this? Because these were not surveys. These were ways in which to use, I think Grace actually remembers this from her days in the school, these were ways of thinking about architecture as a polyphony, as a multifaceted, integrative, and poetic practice. And actually delving into BTC was wonderful, but of course Jorge wasn't teaching it. Where I learned what that meant was actually interacting with Jorge through a studio and a seminar, which was based actually on ruins, and ruins in two senses. It was a seminar that was set in Argentina, in an area of the missions where there are the ruins of the Jesuit missions. And what Jorge was actually after was not simply that, but rather the dialogue of those missions with an indigenous culture, the Guarani people, and the ruin there was what no longer exists. The music, the lace, the sort of transitory lines of inhabitation, of impermanent structures, of ephemeral occupancy. And it was a remarkable lesson for me, because we thought, in fact, about architecture's own stratigraphies. You mentioned type, own stratigraphies, and I would say that Jorge's understanding of architecture might be polyphony, but his understanding of history is embedded in the accretion of ruins. It's as much a geology as it is a kind of cultural, sort of historical narrative. I should let others speak.
You mentioned Argentina, so I will take that
Run
as
with
a
it.
key.
Absolutely.
As a
Run
key
with it.
there. I'll talk like from Argentina in a way, because I got to know Jorge and Rodolfo first being an editor and starting my career at Suma and then at Plot, and in those moments I started a conversation with them and with their work, I would say, directly, right? And when I approach the work and also make the relationships with all of the things that we kind of study when we approach like the history of certain moment of postmodernism and this idea of bringing history back and reinterpreting the idea of history in architecture, they are, of course, kind of like a mandatory quote or something like that. But I think when I try to understand their work in that sense, I think that the canons or certain like architectures, the classics that we can discuss in different ways, I am not a historian, so the vocabulary might not be exact, is also put together with the tradition of Buenos Aires, right? And with all this interpretation of the arquitectura de partido, no? The architecture de parti, and how all that got together with modernism. So there are some layers there that I think that are a coexistence that is super interesting and very particular of their work. I also understand that building text and context bring that kind of post-structuralist or structuralism that was very much present in the 60s and 70s in so many discussions, right? And that is a very kind of interesting relationship with the Universidad de Buenos Aires, with the university and the discussions also in the Escuelita, no? Something very in parallel to that, and that kind of triangle in between discussions in North America, South America, and Europe, in terms of rereading history, rereading what is a theory of architecture, or how is meaning made that is so present in their production. And I feel very related to this idea of the production of meaning that is, of course, omnipresent in the exhibition, in the drawings, not only because it's the name of one of the drawings, but the discussion is constant, right? It's like, how do we produce meaning? And that is a question to history, right? That is a question that is very present there, and that I really think it's key to understand that work.
Yeah, I'd like maybe to go back to Nader's allusion to the idea of erudition as sort of fundamental in the use of history in the work of Machado Silvetti, and also in that specific moment in time. It was one of my first responses when seeing the show, was thinking like how different it is, the use of history in this moment in the late 70s, early 80s to the way that we use history now, right? Where there's a very careful curation of a very specific set. And you mentioned like some of the more sort of the extent to which it's broad, but I would like to emphasize the extent to which it's actually quite deep. And if you read especially, the way that Jorge and Rodolfo write about their historical precedents, it's really telling that I think it's the way we use history today has been broadened, and in a way you would say it's more democratic, right? And we've talked about this, Mark, the way that we relate to history today primarily through images. In a way, everything is available at the same time, and we are free to work with history in architecture. But in a way, those images have been detached from the obligation to correspond to the original moment where they were originated. Versus, I think, the erudition that Nader was talking about had to do with a sort of deeper level of knowledge in the use of specific references and the language of architecture, which I think it's also And you can see the value and how that way of working with history, I think, allowed the creation of what Machado and Silvetti referred to as, I think, informed knowledge, or qualified knowledge. That maybe we like to work now with history in a different way, where we prefer that dissociation and the freedom that comes with it from the depth that you get from the erudition.
I mean, I think this issue of erudition that Nader and Jesus both raised. I mean, one thing about working on this show is, it is a history of Machado and Silvetti, but also it is a history of architecture at large over the last 50 years. So looking at their work and how they dealt with history in relationship to what's happening with La Tendenza, with postmodernism, with neo-rationalism. I find it kind of very fascinating when at the beginning of the semester, one of our guest critics, Emmanuel Chris, and I were walking through the galleries, and he's familiar of some of Machado and Silvetti's work, but not all of them. And when he saw some of the projects, he was stunned, and he was drawing relationship with analog architecture, which was maybe his platform of understanding from a Swiss vernacular. I find that very interesting, that a lot of the history and typology has this type of generosity. Of course, when we discuss these different developments that happen alongside Machado and Silvetti, we also talked about certain times history is treated as a straitjacket. Sometimes history is treated as a springboard for something else. And I think understanding this intricacy was quite exciting for us when we work on the exhibition. I think part of how things are displayed, we certainly use typology as a framework. We certainly, some of the tower projects are grouped together, not only the Chicago Tribune, but also the Times Square, to the Leon Forte being right next to it, to the wall projects of Venice, Cranbrook. So I think having the proximity of some of these projects next to each other, even the time frame being different, was kind of interesting for us to see the parallels. And because at the end, it's history at large, but also the internal history of Machado and Silvetti. Speaking of that, I would also mention the vernacular history of Argentina that Jorge had brought up in his class. Not the canonical history of his education, but kind of the aberrant models to the vernacular of the Carrizo house, I think. As a Roman villa, I thought that was a chorizo house.
Yes.
As a model of the Roman villa.
House, yes. Pancho mentioned once. The sausage house. Yeah, I think there is something present there, but what I was today kind of re-engaging with the drawings in some way, and I think typology is there. I think there's something about composition in terms of what I was mentioning about this Argentinian way of understanding that, but there's something else for me, and I think that's kind of also very interesting, is that we can read all of that through the lenses of kind of the discipline, in a way, which history we want to see, but at the same time, there is kind of a permanent footprint of certain experiences that are projected there. And that's kind of a juxtaposition that is very unique in terms of there are these, as I was saying, footprints, but then there are kind of sneak peeks, of certain things. Sometimes there are like small drawings there, but then if not, the corners, how do each of the spaces relate? They are not kind of exactly the repetition of other projects of that time, of the Tendenza, or just the volumes or just the typology. There is kind of another re-intention. I'm inventing invention was something that was presented here, but reinvention of that typology or re-understanding of that in a way that I think combines many of these things.
Maybe now would be a good time to turn to drawing in general. I want to quote something that Jorge had said in one of the last seminars. He says, "The laboriousness of drawings has something to do with building the building itself. You construct the building as you are drawing it." And then he went on to explain this kind of mantra that he had when he used to draw. And he would say, you just have to put yourself in the 750 bricks. So, of course, drawing now is very, very different. But part of my fascination with even the most elaborate of their drawings is how constructible or buildable they are. And so it's through this intention to detail that they were able to sort of signify or re-semanticize, as you've brought up before, Nader, the components of our cities. So I would like to discuss drawing in the context of all of their work, especially the sort of various themes that are drawn, whether it be the sequential narrative or the technical black and white, orthographic, or the pastels. So maybe Nader, it would be great if you could start with that.
So I think to get into the question of drawing, first of all, I know all of these drawings, I've sort of been surrounded by them, but to see them here all at once is kind of just impressive. Just, I have to say that, and it's just an immersive experience. But to talk about drawing, it requires us also to ask what is representation in itself, because there's many facets to that. So there is one facet of it that, you know, drawings are just illustrating something, but there's moments where a representational technique has an instrumental function. For instance, if you think of the orthogonal drawings of Rodolfo's country house, they are there for a very precise reason, because the oblique function of the corners, the reentrant corners, is the only moment where you understand the relationship between the attributes of those spaces and how they come to signify the difference between what are otherwise identical rooms. So you can only understand that through the technique of perspective, where the floor, the two walls, and the ceiling are co-present on the same page. Then there's another aspect of representation, is that once you understand that you can draw in a certain way through a certain technique, that it may have a critical function. And so Jorge has written extensively on, you know, the ideological nature of perspective, for instance, and how the anamorphic moment effectively dismantles it because of the way it reveals the artifice of the subject within the painting. Or as in this case, obviously there are several works out there, Cranbrook amongst others, that participate in this. And then thirdly, there's another level of representation which goes back to the production of meaning, and that embedded in all of this are also iconographic moments and cultural artifacts that are what I call the elusive signifiers, that are co-present everywhere. They're there right behind us in Leonforte, embedded, encrypted, but you know, you have to look hard to see it. They're there in the Tower of Venice, they are there in Piazza Dante, but they're layered with so many other contingencies that they defy the immediacy of consumption. But I think that these are the three levels in which drawing and representation have a more critical function in their work that I think was instrumental, at least to my education and my participation.
And I guess, Nader, if I might, I think that what you describe has had a profound impact on the pedagogy of the school, actually. It's what's rendered, in many ways, what we do here unique under Jorge's guidance. And here I'm thinking of how, as I think about your history here, Jorge, when you first came to the school, you were also really interested in certain parts of the world and taking students, for example, to Sicily. And I'm thinking of the way in which you managed to expose students both to say what it is to understand an object archivally and what it is to have visual knowledge, to draw and draw and draw until you understand what a building is. And this is as much an act of invention as it is an act of understanding. And you know, when I was really struck, we had a conversation a while back, and you were describing an initial encounter in Caltagirone, where you were looking at a palazzo that actually was completely incoherent and facing a bridge that was extravagant, infrastructural, and around which there was a deep archive. And so you had an object that, in fact, was absent in many ways from the historical record and incoherent in terms of its placement in the urban fabric. And you had a majestic infrastructural presence that had an archive. And you took those students through a kind of, I don't want to use the word dialectical, but you managed to put visual exegesis on par with historical deciphering, so that one could understand how the palazzo's facade had actually had to shift its face to enter into a coherent dialogue with the urban scenography when a bridge arrives. And so, what's lovely about that to me is that you understand history not as only a set of precedents or periods, but also the building itself as a living entity that needs to adjust in order to become a meaningful piece of an urban setting. And this is actually, I would love to hear what you have to say about actually the importance of urban design alongside the architectural here, and this sort of sense or commitment to the fact that the urban, that I love scenografia, but the urban setting, after all, is where we live and where our lives garner meaning. And I think there's always in the background the vivid presence of life around these buildings.
If I may just interject for a second, because I think what you said were quite, the example that Erika just said made me think about the evolution of Machado Silvetti's work in parallel with the evolution of their drawings, or techniques of projection. I think the show allowed me to see the work that was done in 1980. Like, for example, Rodolfo's Mask House, was 90-degree axonometric. What did you call it back then? But
the flat axonometric.
The flat axonometric, compared to the theory of production. The theory of production was the Venice Biennale image of a collection of projects. It was also a collection of projections, but all axonometric, isometric, axonometric, Swazi. So this Yves Lambois' kind of radical reversibility was already embedded in the drawing technique. When 3 years later, when I think about Leonforte, the overlaying of drawings over drawings, or Villa in Perguzia, Michael did that drawing of that perspective, of one-point perspective versus two-point perspective. Some of the work, I'm wondering if you see a certain parallel or effect of how the drawings evolve in parallel with how the work evolved. I'm asking Nader because you wrote this selected biography, so you are a default biographer. Yeah.
Look, yes. First of all, the Venice Biennale drawing is a thing on its own. I think it just deserves its own discussion because there are so many layered narratives in the idea of a composite drawing, the idea that a drawing is a constellation in and of itself. I believe it's one of your students, Daniel Castor, who did the inside-out isometric, where you're looking down and up at an artifact at the same time. It's one of the most amazing drawings, but it extends this tradition in a completely different way, but that, it's too easy to call that a collage, because I like to think of the collage as more inadvertent and somehow more casual. What's scandalous about that drawing is the exactitude of the metrics involved in all of the modules that then fold out and refer from elevation to axon to plan, which is something quite extraordinary. The other dimension of your question has to do with the thing that connects it back to the city. I can't think of the analysis of Caltagirone without thinking of the Villa in Pergusa and the Folly. In the sense that the plans of these things, you can't think of them outside of Teatro Olimpico or the Baroque theater, in which the city is represented as a scenography, and how perspective is an instrumental aspect of how that is constructed. And so, when you draw the plans of these structures, you already have in your mind the ocular nature of one-point perspective versus the idea of the infinite recession of the two-point perspective and the horizon. So I do think that these are different conceptions, that they are projected onto each other in Pergusa and in the Folly is in one way what makes it so pedagogical, because at that moment they're locked into a kind of intellectual embrace that you cannot dismantle them anymore. In other words, that makes you think that you can't just illustrate a space through perspective, that the one point does certain things that cannot be done in 2 point, and that they have to produce a certain condition, mental condition, around which one operates. And so that's what, I guess, made me fall in love with those two projects and the city. By the way, we extended that into Vienna also, into other kinds of...
Yeah, I just have a small comment on that, but I think drawing, of course, kind of conditions the way we think, and the technique conditions the way we think, and we create fictions while we draw. I'm kind of part of the generation that while studying went through, like, it was the change in between starting to draw the whole thing and then go into the computer, right? So that for sure is something that is interesting and pretty obvious, but what I think about the act of drawing, or what you were mentioning, is what the act itself inquires you as a designer, right? There are some questions that the drawing and the mode of representation is asking from you. And again, the point of view might be fictitious. You will never be standing there. It's different things. But the way you define or decide to represent something is like this kind of going back to music and to the publication with it, but like a call and response. And I couldn't help by imagining this. The other day I was talking with Dan Wheeler that was there and drawing and participating in the office, and he was saying that sometimes Jorge would be playing the piano while they were all drawing. And that situation in between the music and the intimacy of thinking and projecting, I think it's kind of a very nice experiential and very simple situation with lots of kind of...
So maybe I can close by going back to Remi's idea about this insistence in the identification between drawing and building, that I think is very, very powerful. And it reminded me your comments of Jorge's writing about realism, where he explains how each art is different, right? And so painting, you're using one material to represent something else, like oil painting to represent a bridge, or in literature, you're using words to... So there's this translation where there's the material of the art and then something that exists outside, and how this is actually not in their minds available to architecture, because when you start drawing a building, that building has already been generated through representation, and then the representation that you're creating is already, in a way, architecture, right? And so this, which I think, I mean, Jorge puts it in much better words, but I think it's really a very intentional flattening or collapse of representation and building. It's a very forceful flattening of those two categories, and I think it's important because of what you mentioned, which in a way, and in my mind, is maybe one of the things that distinguishes the drawings in the exhibition from the drawings of some of the offices that were working at that same time, which is that these drawings have such a powerful, there's such a will to power in those drawings that they really mean to be real, right? It's not even though the degree of sophistication is unbelievable, and sort of there's you could talk about the scopic regimes in the drawings for hours, but they really mean to be real, right? And I think that's really very, very unique.
Well, I have a question for my colleagues here, because as I was hearing you speak just now and about this collapse, it actually made me think back to, I guess, Jorge's complex thinking about type and typology. And I know that you have often sort of set into interesting opposition, say, Argonne's notion of type and typology as opposed to Monet's, which is actually far more contextual and dialectical and might speak a little bit to the kind of collapsing that you mentioned here. And it actually makes me think a little bit about, and I hope you can elaborate, about one of the projects that we see in the exhibit, which is actually the house on the island of Djerba, which strikes me actually as quite crucial because it collapses, or you see a collision and coalescence, and it's quite precipitous, of modernism, cube, classical plan, and Mediterranean vernacular. And it's an astonishing collision, actually. It's quite astonishing. And it speaks exactly to this observation that you made about this kind of collapsing. I always think of a deck of cards. I want to make it a stratigraphy. I want to make it an archaeology. That's, I like ruins. But, I was struck by that in that project in particular. But
Well, I think, some of the comments really help us, maybe Rem and myself, to reflect on the show itself, because, when Erika talked about the engagement to the city, I thought about the drawings, the shift from maybe a projection, axonometric projection, to perspective, where issues of anamorphosis, foreshortening, or a perspectival relationship to the subject becomes more important. Or Nader's comment that theory of production is not a collage, but one drawing with multiple things existing. I mean, I think a lot has to, for me, also the show talks about beginnings. Like I'm trying to think of where was the beginning when a collection of typologies happened in a single project? Was it at Pegusa that eventually become Steps of Providence, that eventually becomes Getty Villa? I'm trying to think of this, the notion of the multiple or relationship between projects. I thought it's really lucky also in this show that we get to see individual projects, some individual projects of Jorge's and Rodolfo's, and then, of course, the collective ones that we all know. But that moment of the folly, for me, was kind of important to see the two Chicago towers next to the folly when the two interlock is almost like the beginning of something else. And I think that was the reason we also wanted to have the plan, inscribed on the floor. But I thought maybe what Jesus talked about in terms of realism might be a segue to our last prompt.
Yeah, because I think this idea of the engagement with realism is like the elephant in the room, right? I think in the show and in the book that gives title to the exhibition. And I think I was thinking about it, and I think maybe from our perspective now, I think this idea of this approach to realism had to do with Rodolfo and Jorge situating themselves as a young practice in a moment where it was very difficult to define the politics of a young practice, right? Coming at the heels of this quarrel between the whites and the grays, which was in many ways a fabricated quarrel, right? And which I think left that generation immediately after in a slightly tricky place where they had to choose between, adhering to a regime of extreme abstraction and autonomy, and then they were liable to be labeled as nihilistic or cynical, or to adhere to a regime of the reprocessing of history, but then they were liable to be labeled as culturally conservative or complacent to market forces, etc. And this idea of unprecedented realism is their attempt to say, no, there has to be a more productive framework for us to continue to engage with history, to continue to engage with reality, and yet stake a social and a sort of a political perspective. And I think, that to that extent, I think this approach to realism is tactical, but then there's also a larger intellectual ambition that has to do with trying to answer some of the bigger questions about the political role of art and the political role of architecture, right? In which the definition of realism is always like a very high stakes part of that discussion, no? That was initiated in the 30s and 40s with people like Bertolt Brecht and Althusser and Adorno, etc., that was never concluded. Right? It's a sort of an unfinished conversation. And I have to say, I really find both Rodolfo and Jorge's writing about realism, but also Michael Hayes' framing of their ideas in the book from 1997 to be some of the best writing about architectural realism, because they have a really sharp way to get at the way in which realism is so different in architecture than it is for the rest of the arts.
I'm thinking about the word realism again, especially in relationship to unprecedented, and I myself initially misread it because I used realism as an anchor for history or for that thing which is culturally grounded. And then I remember, and now I don't remember which article it was, it may be the one on representation, where you describe the relationship between realism and verisimilitude and rhetoric, at which moment you realize that realism is not so much the crutch, but the projective capacity to persuade the reader into something that is actually quite insane. And that's where the unprecedented comes in. In other words, there's a lot of things that are out there that lure you in, but they don't lure you back. They have a projective capacity to imagine something that's completely impossible. And so that it's this projective quality of realism which changed my understanding of their thesis,
And what you're describing, I think, is consistent with the way that they identify themselves more in the sort of Bertolt Brecht camp, where there's the possibility to create new meaning through the combination of disparate things, but also acknowledging that some of those techniques coming from surrealism and adjacent movements are not available to architects, right? And I like that they explained that is because of the specifics of the technique of architecture and things like tectonics, right? So surrealism relies on the juxtaposition of things that cannot coexist, and in retaining that difference and that tension for us to then sort of imagine that new possibility, versus architecture through tectonics is basically an art of reconciliation of things, right? Like you can retain some contrast, but you're going to be managing that difference, right? Like we cannot just throw the sewing machine and the umbrella in the operating table, right? We're going to have to mediate those things somehow. And I think, I don't know, I find that really illuminating.
And just let me go out on a limb here, thinking about realism not simply in terms of the way you use it, but as an object of theoretical discourse in the second half of the 20th century. I was struck sort of looking at some of the projects, and I think it's the Piazza Dante, where you have a fountain, you have a staircase, you have an esplanade. Now imagine you walk up there and you are suspended in an urban context, and you see, smell, hear the city. And to me, I think it also translates that way. It's not phenomenology in a vexed sense at all. It's, how about this? It's the way that architecture renders vivid. And to me, that's the sort of, that's where I find the real.
Well, I think this is a nice closing comment to our first
Oh
session.
my goodness.
But I thank you, everyone. I love this comparison with Brecht. You know, I think there's a certain estrangement always in Machado's and Silvetti's work, but what I appreciate is also a latent sense of hedonism that makes it very strong. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Excellently done. We clear the table of the first course, and we move on to the next. So we turn now to a collection of tributes, really, I would say, to Jorge from an assortment of people. And I actually, so this is a collection of people that Jorge has asked to speak. And I love that the range shows a range of periods, a range of ages, a range of experiences with Jorge and with Rodolfo. So I'm going to introduce our next four speakers briefly, but all at once, and then ask them to just come up one after another. So we start with our youngest participant for the tributes, although I think, Remi, you're the most recent graduate if you want to compete. So Nicolas Delgado Alcega, who received his MArch in March, or in 2020, sorry. When you have March 20, it looks like you, anyway. Got his MArch degree in 2020, received his BArch from the University of Miami, and is one of the founding editors of the fabulous GSD student journal Pairs, a journal dedicated to conversations with designers, academics, and activists. Elisa Silva, who's received her MArch in 2002, is founder and principal of Enlace Arquitectura and Enlace Foundation. She's received pretty much every possible architecture award or fellowship, including the Rome Prize from the American Academy, our own Wheelwright Fellowship, a Graham Foundation grant, and the Lucas Artist Fellowship. So you might want to trap her at the reception to find out how. Michael Maltzan, who received his MArch in 1988, founded his eponymous firm in 1995. His projects range from cultural institutions to city infrastructure, including most recently the 6th Street Viaduct in Los Angeles. He currently serves on the Dean's Leadership Council and the GSD's Visiting Committee. Calvin Tsao, who received his MArch in 1978, is co-founder and partner of the New York City-based architecture practice Tsao and McClain. Calvin serves on the board of the American Academy in Rome and also serves on the Dean's Leadership Council here at the GSD. So I welcome the four of you in that order to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Good? Higher, yeah, well. As the most recent of Jorge's students tasked with an address tonight, I'm of course challenged by the need to select my words without the benefit of the passage of time. After talking at length with Jorge about this question of time, I've understood that memory has the most valuable quality, not of always reminding us what mattered the most, but actually constantly revising our recollection based on what feels most useful about our past experience as we tackle the present. A valuable but treacherous quality through which our mind recalls what is in our personal interest, sometimes at the expense of the truth. Treacherous mostly because of how much this way of the mind then affects how we shape our disciplines, our political identities, our institutions, and our social contract. So today I'll share one lesson that I have received from this teacher of teachers and let everything else in the back of my mind sit and wait patiently for their turn to reveal themselves. All of those things that have worked their magic on me precisely because they've remained invisible. I'll share something that I feel has shaped me and which, despite the lack of hindsight, I think can make a positive contribution in today's climate. I've also made this choice because if I know something about Jorge, is that he would like this celebratory retrospective moment to have a projective quality as well. Jorge is not the isolated architect or academic that needs to shun the pace of the world to advance what interests him. He is fascinated by history, by our innately human way of relating to material culture, and by that fleeting creative moment in which an architectural idea is generated. But none of that broods in his mind at the expense of whatever is going on around him. He is rather informed and driven by the pressures of the world because he knows that there is no stepping outside of culture and society, no pure, ideal space from which we can operate. There's only working from within. I think this is because Jorge has a great passion for dialogue. It is this constant exchange with those that surround him which gets his head going. And I believe dialogue is that messy, generative process that leads Jorge towards those unlikely revelations of his. And I say messy because in the process, Jorge will surely tell you what he believes emphatically, because there will likely be strong disagreement amongst the parts, and because it will be a non-linear process in which it will be hard to predict when the resulting fruit will be harvested. But anyone that has shared with Jorge will be able to tell you that in this sport, he is a humble and sincere player, one who values the potential latent in human exchange much more than the fleeting satisfaction of being right or of asserting authority. And I think it goes without saying that this is a quality without which one does not survive, or better, excel at the GSD for 50 years. But it's also perhaps a quality that has made Jorge as a teacher, as a mentor, and as a human being available to so many generations of students. Jorge doesn't just convey positions that he has already made up his mind about and expects you to follow. He takes what the world and us students throw at him, but not to regurgitate it back and please us, not because he wants us to feel heard and somewhat in control so he can ultimately get his way. Jorge has no populist tools in his gear. Instead, he listens to us sincerely, but not without his own position. He dissects what we are saying, works with the parts that truly make sense to him, and reopens the debate about what doesn't. I think this is how Jorge really learns. Of course, in the company of great buildings and great books, but also people. However, it takes two to play this game. And I think no matter at what point, on which spectrum we are each on, we can all learn something from this creative, at times chaotic way of creating a corner of the world for individuals to coexist. And from this exemplary, surely imperfect architect, teacher, and intellectual. Moments of instability of any kind make us rigid, intolerant, and defensive. As individuals and groups and as societies, we desperately yearn for order. I know this from personal experience, and I also know firsthand the consequences of giving into this feeling at a societal scale. Rigidity makes us unable to adapt to circumstance and learn new information. Intolerance makes us blind to the needs of the other, especially when the other looks like an adversary at a given moment in time. Defensiveness then makes us violent, reckless, and extremely clumsy. The present always feels urgent, I think. It seems to me that for Jorge, it always has. And nonetheless, even if some days you see that he's not sure what the path forward is, and you see it brings him down, he doesn't despair. He lets the world in, but he's not destabilized by its turbulence. He enjoys let's see. He enjoys the work that he does and the discipline he has dedicated his life to profoundly, and he works from this place, focused on generative rather than degenerative action, through love for rather than hate towards something, and he is always moving forward with a naive, even if I'm sure actually conscious, desire classical of the architect to believe that his actions can be edifying even when everything around is a tad bleak. So let me end with a most grateful, humble, and truly heartfelt thank you, Jorge. Thank you, thank you, thank you for everything of yourself that you've given me and everyone else too.
I was a student at the GSD when Jorge was chair of the architecture department. Jorge has been an invaluable mentor to me, and as I reread our email exchanges over the past 20 years, I need to thank him for all his wisdom and guidance for sure, but also patience, since some of my more anxious messages are frankly embarrassing. But I wanted to use these precious minutes to convey to you his relationship with students during those years. Incredibly accessible, ready to laugh, and dearly loved. So much so that just after he delivered his lecture, The Muses Are Not Amused, on April 25th, 2002, to celebrate his chairmanship, we dared project a video of the wildest skit in front of the entire school. And although he has not seen it since then, I know he remembers it fondly. The skit was a gesture of affection and admiration that I find completely unfathomable in today's context. It was staged as a special edition of 20 minutes, projected into the future in 2020. I was the reporter, and I encountered fellow classmates who, like myself, were presumably not practicing architecture. Eerily, 20 years have passed. I found the tape and was only able to recover a very poor quality sound, but enough to decipher the script. And so via Zoom, we recorded it once again. And full disclaimer, all three of us in the skit do practice architecture.
Here we are at the Critical Bloom, a local garden shop owned by my friend Carlos Arnaiz.
Excuse me, sir.
You scared me. And Bacchus, my friend.
Terribly sorry for both of you. I wanted to trouble you for 100 dandelions.
Dandelions, please. Such ugly blooms. All rhetoric. No fireworks. You know, you need to think about the criticality, the monumentality. Beauty comes first. For example, take this hydrangea. The petals are almost classical, symmetrical. They are not many things. They are, through the whole and its parts, the original thickness.
Wait, but the space that I want to use, it's dark. There's no light.
Yes, that's true, but you know, what you need to ask yourself is, what is it doing urbanistically? You know, you have to orchestrate a montage. For example, what you need is something more intelligent. I think what you need is an unprecedented realism. An orchid, this orchid, for example, it's only $2,000, but it's unprecedented in its realism.
We find ourselves now on the stage of the Theoretical Kitchen, the most popular show on the Food Network, hosted by the ever-famous Woodrow Woods, known to us dearly as Woody.
In the chef's relentless dream of designing new culinary dishes, it is instrumental as the shift from main course to dessert. We should not be rapid, but gradual. I used to have a productive contradiction in my early dishes. Salt, pepper, azúcar. But it turns out that the philosophical, epistemological ideas of breakfast as opposed to brunch articulated a theory that was opposed to cooking. I invented the notion of red wine vis-a-vis meat, y blanca, or white wine, a priori pescado, fish. In my more sad days, I invented a dish. It was called plato de maíz. It was sadly delicious, sadly delicious. But when you create a tantalizing dish, it is critical to identify the indigenous beauty of the shadows that are in the meal, to find a way to locate the critical act in the act of making in the platter itself, perhaps the very locus of what we call beauty, pleasure, and mouth-watering taste.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Okay, so
That was brilliant. Jorge, congratulations on such a wonderful career. Thank you for being a great inspiration for so many generations of students.
I second that. Congratulations, Jorge, on an amazing career. And thank you for being an inspiration to me in my cooking and to many generations of students.
Beyond appreciating your acute critical spirit, your sense of humor, and your gentle support, Jorge, you set the standard so high for all of us who really want to see you still as our role model. Thank you so much.
Wow. Jorge and Rodolfo's influence on my work and me personally didn't end when I left Boston for Los Angeles many years ago. 5 minutes is a short time to try to describe how much they continue to be a part of my life as an architect. I did the math before, and it works out to be something like 8 years of influence for every 1 minute I get to talk this evening. There are many memories. You've heard a number of them, of course, from different people. But for me, they include being asked gleefully, I might add, by Jorge and Rodolfo to drive a huge moving truck filled with their drawings and models that are out in the lobby right now to the new office on Harrison Street in Boston, rush hour traffic, which I still count as probably the top most terrifying experience of my life. But a better first memory from that time is coming up from RISD on a Bonanza bus to draw at Jorge and Rodolfo's. The office was in the front converted parlor room, and a large bay window looked out off the entry at Marlborough Street. We'd sit in that room and draw for hours, immersed in the physicality of making something line by line. What I remember is the expansiveness of those days, as opposed to the ability now of doing many drawings, sometimes a bit unconsciously. Jorge would insist that the effort was always to make each line of the drawing speak to the full complexity of the ideas. Not out of some idea of efficiency, but because the lines you were making quite literally held all of the architecture of the project. We couldn't always keep up with Jorge in the verbal sparring and debates that he loved to instigate, but we could sit down with him and connect those ideas through the drawings, and where a sharing of ideas very generously would always take place with him. At that particular moment, the future direction of architecture was in conflict. There was a very real fight going on between proponents of modernism and postmodernism, and it wasn't clear which side might win. Within that debate, Jorge and Rodolfo seemed to offer another way. We read Jorge's essay, The Beauty of Shadows, over and over, as it spoke to my generation who was searching for our own way forward in architecture as we tried to express the complexities of our contemporary moment. Although I was often working in the office, it wasn't until my fourth year at RISD that Jorge was my studio professor. The project was an opera house in Providence. Opera houses are complex programmatic machines, and I was like the others in the studio, struggling to move beyond overly simplistic conceptual plan diagrams. Recognizing our collective dilemma, Jorge created an exercise where we were to find pieces of plans from built projects, Xerox them, cut them up, and collage them into our buildings as a way of jump-starting some density and complexity to the plan. I was incredibly skeptical, as it seemed like cheating, but we followed his instruction and came back with our collages. And then something miraculous happened. Even though we had started from a series of appropriated plans, as we drew and drew and drew on top of those collages, we began to override them with our own ideas and personalities. It was an epiphanal moment for me as I came to realize a lesson about the potentials and the connection between history, precedent, and personal invention in architecture. The summer before starting at the GSD, I was traveling in Sicily with Jorge. There were a series of projects and research works that he was doing there. We spent time in Palermo, Leonforte, and the coastal town of Cefalù, also seemingly exotic from a place where I had grown up in the post-war suburbs in the US. In Cefalù, we met the architect Pasquale Culotta, who took us, along with his wife, to dinner in a tiny restaurant in a small mountainside town. The Culottas drove with an impressive Italian abandon, which made the car ride a little death-defying. Arriving back at the town plaza, Jorge and I unpeeled our hands, dug into the seats, and then made our way to espresso. As we got to the center of the square, Mr. and Mrs. Culotta split. She was a socialist, and the socialists had their coffee on one side of the square, and Pasquale was a monarchist, and they had coffee on the other side of the square. In the middle, there was the cathedral with its Byzantine mosaic of Christ that Venturi had made famous in complexity, presiding like a judge over the proceedings. They hurled insults at each other from across the plaza. And then coffee was over, and as if nothing had happened, we all came back together to continue a walk through the town. Even though I was only there because of Jorge, nobody made me feel like that. Because of Jorge, you became an equal member in the conversation, fortunate to listen and learn, but expected to contribute as well. During that trip, I kept thinking about the drawings that had to be made for those projects. I was reminded of Manfredo Tafuri's end piece in Eisenman's book on Giuseppe Tehrani, where he describes a child returning home from the beach with a basket full of seashells. At the seashore, the shells are wet, beautiful, full of color and texture. But when the child gets home and looks into the bucket at the dry shells, they find they have lost all of their life. How can you represent a culture, its atmosphere, its thickness in a drawing? And yet, that is what every drawing we were making attempted to do, to go beyond simple description and begin to have the personality, the texture, and the sensuality of the place. It's maybe an impossible task, but a very beautiful goal. We recently completed a house on the beach in Malibu, and after it was published, Jorge wrote me. The house has a distinct plan form relating to an exaggeration of its relationship to the ocean view. Because of this, the design is mostly represented in plan, but the house also floats one story above the beach, which means much of the three-dimensional experience of the house is probably better understood in section. I've been struggling with how to make that section. We had dozens of drawings that were a part of the technical documents, but none of them could capture the idea and the experience at the same time. And because I didn't have a section, Jorge naturally asked me to see one. You can be out of school for 35 years, but when your professor asks if he can see the one drawing that you haven't done, a panic you should have outgrown years ago still shoots up and down your spine. during the entire plane ride here, that missing section has been on my mind. And I continue to struggle with how to do that one drawing. I have to figure it out. But perhaps more than anything, what that's taught me and what I've learned from Jorge is the beauty in the pursuit as much as in the result. And also that I still owe Jorge that one damn drawing.
Hi, this is very hard to follow. All these amazing recollections, all of which I concur. And of course, I was so moved by the panel, which so elegantly dissected and determined and made concrete your polyphonic methodologies. That's so informed your practice, but also turned into such a formidable pedagogical tool. And I have to say, I'm so deeply grateful that I am probably your student zero. Jorge has been, and Rodolfo has been in my life and studies for 50 years to this year, in 1972. When I was 18 and I was a sophomore at UC Berkeley, and you were a TA, and I remember seeing you from, what do you call it, a worm's eye view, because I was sitting on the floor, as was the style of the day, in my cutoffs and flip-flops and macrame. And you in your ever so skin-tight sailor pants with a red star pinned to your beret, and a leather jacket, of course, perfectly weathered. But anyway, I was actually unsure what I really wanted to do. In the early 70s, the world was open to you, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I was trying things out, and I thought, well, why not architecture? So it was my first studio course, and I was bumbling through it, and he had the patience to let me explore, meander, fall flat on my face, with just a very sleight of hand to keep me interested for just a minute, because I diverted to the theater. And you did not pass judgment. You just said, well, go ahead. And I went to graduate school in the theater, coincidentally in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, where Jorge and Rodolfo just so happened to be teaching again. There, my tutelage was not academic, but I think no less important, maybe more, because they taught me how to live. And that's why I think, makes me think about today, what is pedagogy, what is tutelage, what is teacher, what is student? Because your generosity, both of you actually, had been that there's no line between teacher and student. Everything is flat. As I think Nicolas might have said, which I agree, that the discourse and the challenge and the questioning and the invitation to all of that. Yes, you always want to win sometimes, but but just for a minute. And you will come back and say, well, I have some other thoughts. And, maybe you might be just a little bit right. But the word that came, I think it was Mark who said during the first panel, is hedonism. It's a delicious hedonism that I think that informed both your practice and your tutelage. I think that's the magic, I think is so, so true, that you can't separate the two. And I know these days, currently, we have to very much define roles. Those roles, I think we're part of a generation that was very loose, and we benefit from that looseness. and that we can have an exchange that travels back and forth from the personal to the official or the professional. And I'm forever grateful for that kind of education. I think it's not really education, it's a mutual learning. And at this point, I have to bring out something, a book, or your book. It's Introductions by Jorge Silvetti. And I was very lucky because he devised an opportunity for me to teach here under the Elliott Noyes visiting professorship. And this is a really great book because they're all just sort of introduction to a lot of lectures here. And truly, I go through it as much as I have gone through your Beauty of Shadows or many other writings. But this one particularly has a human aspect. And also, I can see the dialectics you're facing when you are talking about someone else's work. And of course, mine, I just want to take one passage which is interesting. He says, I've become, so it says, here it is. In my long teaching, I've become aware of the limitations of teaching and how little credit, if any, a teacher can take for a student's professional services. And you can't say that, well, my pride has no claim whatsoever on Calvin's success. He said, I believe teaching design is ultimately a conversation between equals. The best a teacher could hope for is to create a favorable conditions for the student's design and artistic talents to flourish and surpass limitations. Calvin, in fact, represents a failure in my teaching, since I never found limits to his talent. I have to beg to differ in this case. I would say limitations is the wrong word, because what you have done to generations of generations, and today is proof, because when I hear Nicolas, all four of us speak of our experiences so endearingly, and I'm going to divert a little bit from this. In Pittsburgh, I remember you invited me to your house, and in the house, just in the front door, there was a huge poster of Pink Flamingos by John Waters. And that's just that moment, just like blew my mind, or it's just screwed up, I don't know, liberated, something. So I leave that to you to decipher what is the meaning of this moment of teaching. But I think what you do is you are a liberator. You liberated us from the confines of our experience at the time. You challenged us, you embraced and encouraged us to think bigger. You unlocked our unknown potential and then send us off our way, because you know that with your encouragement and support, we'll get there somewhere, wherever that is. And I just, without being too, I can't help but being sentimental about this, but and it is a tribute after all. I can see that you're still doing that because Nicolas's words resonates, every single word resonate with me, so I didn't have to repeat that because I could repeat the same speech. And that's, what, 45 years later. So I would say this is another beginning, because I look forward to still many years of mutual influence and support. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite beautiful. We are missing one tribute, which was Michael Hayes and his absence tonight. He is ill. He can't be here tonight. palpable, because I think his voice would have also been quite moving among the others. So I'm acutely aware that I'm the only voice between you all and our honoree, Jorge. I'm also following so many amazing and moving observations on the panel, which I thought was really terrific, and tributes. I'm also aware that I cry absurdly easily when I'm talking publicly about friends at important moments. So I'm going to be really brief. So I was not Jorge's student, either at RISD or at the GSD, but Jorge hired me here at the Department of Architecture, first as a design critic in 1999, and then as an assistant professor in 2000. And I think that many of the comments, even from your students, resonate. So Jorge, and I've been waiting for this, so Jorge, Jorge was demanding as a chair. I think I can use that term. So at public lectures, if the speaker was a little bit superficial or going on a little too long, you'd suddenly feel this toe tapping very decisively, and you'd look, and it was Jorge, and it was a signal that things had gone on too long. So this was a time when faculty came to all the meetings, faculty showed up at all the lectures, and there was just no question of it. Like there was a sort of demanding world here. And I think it was a sort of extraordinary time, a demand, but also a respect. But I want to focus not on my time here with you at the GSD, because I actually met you earlier, which you don't remember, I'm sure. You were on a jury at Princeton when I was a student there. It wasn't my jury, thank God. It wasn't even my class. But we were watching, because everyone in the school was very aware. It was a very animated jury. And there was a moment when one of the other jurors was going on at great length, and Jorge interrupted, and he said, and I won't, despite Woody and Carlos doing terrific Jorge imitations, I'll refrain from sharing mine, but Jorge interrupted, and he said, you are not talking about the project. You are talking about yourself. So sit down and shut up. This was an extraordinary moment. This was just mind-boggling. This is historic among our years at Princeton, because this was to another juror. And so so oftentimes we talk about the jury system as, the people on the jury weren't paying attention to the students, blah, blah, blah. Here was a juror who cut the conversation short and said, the importance of the jury is talking about the project, and the willingness to stop a jury at another school, I have to say, was extraordinary. And I see that really as the kind of impatience with self-serving discourse, the importance and the centrality of the project, and the concern for the student, frankly, and the importance of that moment was huge for me, and remains sort of one of the strongest echoes of your voice in my head, even though it was way long ago and before I even sort of formally met you. So I want to thank you for that insistence consistently on the project, on the importance of the project as something that we should all be focused on, and for what you did to make this place such a strong school. And that has resonated throughout and will continue to resonate. But right now, I want to invite you to the podium to share your thoughts.
Well, it is truly very, very tough to follow. What can I say? I mean, what kind of thing I can say after all that has been said, and in the beautiful way that it has been said? overwhelmed, really, and joyful at the same time. I think I know the easy part on where to start, and it is also my thanks to a lot of people. First of all, I want to thank those who appeared on stage tonight: Erika, Nader, Florencia, Jesús and Remi, Elisa, Calvin, Michael, and Nicolas. Thanks for your words, your kindness, your continuous friendship. Thanks especially to Sarah and Mark, who so fervently supported and helped to promote the archive, the exhibit, and a coming book. To the library, that sacrosanct institution within our institution, for all it does for us, and particularly for this event. And in this, I want in particular to thank Inés Salduento, I don't know where she is, the archivist in chief, as I call her, an architect in her own right and a GSD MArch2 graduate of our school, for her participation in the seminars and that we taught on the archive, and her contributions to the exhibit. And of course, million thanks to Dan Borelli and his troops for so actively and devotedly, day to day, giving their time, ideas, and solutions, and that extra help, well beyond their duty, to get this exhibition up and down. Finally, to all the students that participated in my very last 2 seminars that dealt with 2 different ways with the process of understanding and interpreting our archive. What else after this I can do? Well, there is one more thing for sure. It's a second round of thanks to the speakers tonight for something very specific that they did not do. Earlier on, some of them had contacted me and kindly asked my opinion as to what kind of speech I thought would be appropriate. I quickly responded, first, that they should, of course, say whatever they wanted that involved our times together and architecture. But second, 2 more things I suggested not to do. First, that whatever they said, it should not make the event's tone to gravitate toward becoming a long obituary. I've been already in too many similar occasions promoted as celebrations. We'd end up with people embracing, sobbing, and in tears. And particularly not this week when we just begin to recover from the longest and omnipresent funeral in history. And second, and on the same vein, but on the opposite side of solemnity, I told them, please, let's not steer this event in the direction of what seems to be a very tempting genre on these occasions, the roasting of the honoree. Not because it's me, well, a little bit because of me, but because, again, based on experience, I definitely find these force exercises on being funny pretty depressing and vulgar, which inevitably end up unintentionally, but predictably, by offending somebody and angering others. Thanks for adhering to these 2 requests, and even more for doing such a brilliant and inspiring act instead. So what's next? I did prepare these words I'm reading as I was trying at the same time, unsuccessfully, to picture this event in advance. It was impossible to imagine what it was going to happen. So I put down, writing, what came to my mind, but there is no plan really on what I wrote finally. No message that was conceived a priori, no bio, not reminiscences. Somewhat free associations that begin to create a chain. And in that vein, I decided to ask you first, how do you like my jacket tonight? Believe me, this is not an improvisation or a joke. I wanted to talk about my jacket, so I wrote about it. I want to because I imagine at this moment I would feel absolutely self-conscious about it, and I am. So I need to flash this out as quickly as possible. I did it because this jacket really cannot be ignored. You never seen me on anything like this. It's brand new, especially made for the occasion, and should I go on? It is luscious, luxurious, sensual, gorgeously beautiful. You cannot not react to it. And it is also intentional because in my thoughts throughout the last few days, as I struggled about what I would say in 15 minutes in this very special and heavy occasion, the jacket made sporadic but insistent appearances. So if I could not expel it from my thoughts, then I would make it part of what I said. First of all, this jacket, in spite of what it may appear, is not the result of self-indulgence. While it was generated by an impulse, yes, I'm madly in love with the fabric. It is irresistible. It was soon mediated by reasoned and considered arguments and by the conviction that what I was doing was correct. That what I was doing was just taking another step forward in the definition of my own self, a process which has lasted more or less 8 decades and is still going on. It should be noted that there is tremendous, unbelievable craft behind this jacket. That of a master tailor located in Rome, Italy, who possesses lots of knowledge, rigor, and discipline in cutting, sewing, and shaping difficult and exquisite fabrics, like this one that I've known since the late 80s, when Rodolfo and I designed and built one of our first projects, the one-of-a-kind clothing shop, Portantina. Where is the... Oh. Portantina in Madison Avenue, New York, that had the exclusivity of offering the artisanal stamped and colored silk velvets produced in a venerable Venice workshop by the followers of legendary Mariano Fortuny, who created them in the early 20th century. Fabrics that I saw being produced in situ when at the time of this job I visited often, and since then I had dreamed about them. Yet, always said to myself, it's not for me. Until 3 decades later, when I saw them again this last February, 2022, this time in a jacket worn by a very close friend of mine who spoke here very, very recently, but I'm not going to identify. And I realized that I could have indeed worn this type of fabric all along myself, that I would have loved it. And so I decided to proceed, and he helped me obtain one. I do not regret it. Rather, I am sorry I waited so long. Why? Just because I thought it was not for me, which is, of course, a clear case of self-repression. This recent episode of self-awareness, self-criticism, and fulfillment, which is contemporary with my involvement with our archive, with the 2 seminars taught about it, and the exhibition outside, which I have brought to light. I think this should stay. Yeah, it's better. That I brought to light photographs, excuse me. This recent episode, of self-awareness, self-criticism, and fulfillment, which is contemporary with my involvement with our archive, with the 2 seminars taught about it, and the exhibition outside, and which has brought to light photographs, drawings, sketches of the Portantina shop, and of course, of the gorgeous sickle velvets fabrics that were the source of great part of Rodolfo and my design inspiration in this project, in a more wider scope brought also to my memory the role played by this constant, intense critique and self-critique we developed and practiced with a vengeance on the repressions that we felt were imposed on us by a modernist aesthetic sensibility that we felt was playing their last cards. It was throughout this intellectual, intense, and committed critical design activity that in our youthful years we became the architects that we are. And without modesty, we contribute distinctively to the forces that effected a concrete impact in our generation and our architecture in general at the time. A critical practice uniquely articulated in the works of architecture itself, in the designs of buildings from which we lifted all the prohibitions we had felt had been imposed on them. All the design no-nos, the all-white, non-color buildings, the conscious avoidance of any expression of form in the pursuit instead of the supposed honesty of the registration of function and structure, the banishment of any possible figural reference that were dissipated in the fog of abstract space. Portantina is all about visual senses, visual and tactile in particular, about visual illusions, trompeurs, about touching materials, silk velvets, moires that flicker as one moves, aged copper and mannequins that populated it, and it was critiqued by a purposely excessive stimulation of vision and touch. It was a joy, and by the way, it was a tremendous retail success while the shop lasted. Should I also add that it was all explored through handmade and mechanical drawings? It was all architecture. This attitude of dissatisfaction and rebellion was prevalent throughout, and not just about architecture, form and expression. We were part of a generation that rebelled against major conventions and repressions of the society at large of the times, and about concrete, serious political facts. For sure, the war in Vietnam, the sexual taboos still dominating us, the desire and necessity that gave impulse to demand the redefinition of the public space, which we took back. A generalized critical attitude permeated everything we did, and through each one of these instances, in their own modes, they all became vehicles to express ourselves, which in turn contributed to our most personal and individual desires and pursuits. My generation can be characterized as the axis of a hinge around which society swung and changed drastically, rapidly, and forever, half a century ago. Within that swing, there was also architecture, which we did, and we acted and produced always architecturally. In each instance, Rodolfo and I changed gears and switched back and forth as needed from the general social and political sentiments and upheavals to our own métier, architecture, where we focus on design, on how to articulate through forms, materials, and the spatial organization of the activities that it was going to house and promote, so that architecture could contribute with its own and unique equipment to those changes. We never confuse these domains. In this context, and early on in our career, and as culmination of this continual critical productive process of deconstructing, distilling, and reformulating conventions and demolishing taboos, Rodolfo and I produced one paradigmatic project that energized our work and put us, and put us on the map, and was acknowledged by many as a breakthrough. It was a project that demonstrates many things, almost all of them exclusively through design moves. I said almost because there were just only a few words accompanying this project, almost an epigram, that strongly resonated with everyone interested in what was happening in architectural culture at the time. The project is the Fountain House. It is outside. And the words that touch a whole community's nerve spelled out by Rodolfo and included in a joint text accompanying our submission to the PA Awards, that's the cover of the magazine, can be seen as a presentation card, if you wish, of our architecture and ourselves. The words, architecture without guilt, or who is afraid of splendid buildings. The jury of PA Awards went wild. Cesar Pelli said, "We've never seen anything like this." And he meant it positively, so that was good. And we got our first wide-open recognition that launched with a bang our reputation and reinforced the direction of our work. Charles Moore, at the peak of his fame, and to whom we had shown the project in advance months before for advice, and who also got an award in the same issue, signed his entry with a warm and generous acknowledgement and apology for the rip-off. Now, it is interesting, okay, here, and we'll just stay there. Actually, very interested and curious that almost 4 decades after, and in times with social turbulence, dissatisfaction, and critical activity engaged on reformulating conventions and changing social mores, and intending to develop social and political consciousness, that is, right now, as Mallik was working on the conception of this exhibit, he proposed that the name of the exhibit should be Architecture Without Guilt, or Who is Afraid of Splendid Buildings, to the delight of Rodolfo and I. But soon after, some doubts and questions emerged, and it was decided that such title was a bit too risque, too ambiguous in its epigrammatic form for these particular times when words can become mountains of polemics, misinterpretations, and discord, and probably another title would be better. We understood the concern and agreed to change it for another, while, of course, lamenting silently that something so significant would be missing from the occasion. It was decided instead to go with Unprecedented Realism, which it must be said clearly and without doubt that in the end, as a title for a show like this, is a much, much more appropriate one, as it embraces better all the breadth of our work, because while the earlier proposal appeal was that it was emotive, based on sentiments and desires, the second, and one adopted, was sounder and firmer, based on conceptual grounds and about aesthetics and the creative process. And we cannot but feel very happy with it, because Unprecedented Realism, again coined by Rodolfo, who is very good at this epigram, is another one of those phrases that have helped define the identity of our work ever since it was articulated at the same period that we were doing the work in Portantina. But as you see, I was not going to miss the opportunity to bring this little hiccup in the process of development of this event during the 15 minutes that have been allocated to me, because it is still lingering in my mind. And why? Because I have not come up with a clear answer. And I would leave it to each of us to ponder this question. It is puzzling that it has happened precisely at a moment like this. But while waiting for my own answer and explanation, it is quite clear to me that, while I am a firm believer that history never repeats itself, for the first time in my whole long life, we are participating in another cultural upheaval, another hinge that certainly resembles in intensity the critical years we lived through in the late 60s and 70s. But I also remember that our generation made mistakes, and some very big ones indeed, that by the 80s, some of its energies had been completely wasted by distortions, misalignments, and frankly, ignorance and indulgence. I keep reflecting on all this history that is so close to me and trying to discern what went right and what went wrong. I would hope that the collection of our work, which will remain in this institution for anyone that is interested in how to move architecture forward to become more relevant by deploying best its unique potentials, will come to study, analyze, question, and learn from our experience, with a total confidence that if there is any strength and lesson contained in these drawings, models, sketches, it is a result of an unflagging, undeterred determination to insist stubbornly on the integrity of the project of architecture, on the necessity of not deviating the focus from that which is architecture and what it can actually do, and not in fantasies of attaining goals that clearly belong to other, much more important and apt cultural and political practice. That it is a mistake or failure that we proudly did not commit, but so many around us falling for and erring because of these temptations. These drawings, models, sketches, epigrams, and text all attest to a conviction that we must practice our métier seriously and with architectural rigor. That by looking at these drawings with certain dedication could help see in them an effort to clarify and demonstrate where the real power of architecture resides. But also, and conversely, and as important, infer what kinds of things architecture cannot pretend to have the capacity to achieve within the fields of human action in our search for happiness, equality, and freedom. We started by helping in the demolition of the naive political aspirations of modern architecture that prove sterile and detrimental to the flourishing of its most promising potentials. And we stuck on that line almost religiously and did not get confused with intellectual distractions. This is not unlike what I expected from this jacket, when after 30 years I elected finally to have it. I expected to do exactly no more and no less what it can so superbly do within its capacities, and then doing its very best with sound knowledge, craft, experience, and imagination in order to serve, in this case, my emotional and material needs. And so it does with a creative design that focuses on the materiality and on the ability to imagine how it would adopt a very particular form that would make this Venetian silk velvet look feel and perform at its best. Frankly, it is a splendid jacket, isn't it? And through with my farewell, and as we move to the reception, please don't feel shy if you feel tempted to touch my jacket. It is quite beautiful and rewarding to the senses. Thank you.
I want to make one thing clear before we move to the exhibit, which I think has been a subtext of this entire evening. So the Rodolfo Machado and Jorge Silvetti collection is part of what we're celebrating tonight. This collection, which has been given to Loeb Library, includes 198 folders of drawings, 25 boxes of project files and other files with personal photographs and photographs from their office and of their office, including the many teams that participated in these projects, so we can get photos of everyone with more hair. There are also additional files with academic work, including course descriptions, syllabi, student work. The exhibition in the lobby is a selection of over 100 drawings, some from the collection, some not, culled from the 47 projects that are included in this archive. I wonder if the jacket will appear in the collection someday. I invite you all to join us in the exhibit and to feel this fantastic jacket. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it very much.